Classical Conversations presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series on school choice. I'm excited to have a friend of the show on. He has been on the show before. I've been on his show, and he is a frontline news reporter, journalist, homeschools his kids classically with Classical Conversations. His wife's tutored. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alex Newman to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
Alex, each episode this week, we're talking about a little bit different nuances and different perspectives about the school choice movement. And I always just want to be clear that when we talk about school choice in this reference, we're not talking about the parents' ability to choose to send their kids to private school or homeschool them or public school or charter school. What we're talking about is the government really financing all educational choices. We're really the only option or the predominant option and expectation that we're setting in society is that it's the government's responsibility to fund good things, to fund education. And so school choice, 100% funded by the government is what we're referring to. And Alex, you've had the privilege of living internationally. You do a lot of things on research on the United Nations. And one of the things that I found interesting was just everything that was happening in Sweden. And of course, for those who don't know, it's illegal now to homeschool in Sweden. But when were you there? And can you tell us a little bit about your experience and what's going on there? And we can maybe give some more history as we talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, again, for having me on. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And it's very ironic that they chose the name School Choice to define their movement. My guess is they had some marketing and PR companies involved because it was a very clever title. Nobody wants to be against choice, right? People love choice. It's kind of like when the people who want to support abortion call it abortion rights. Well, you don't want to be the guy who's opposed to rights. But the reality is, and I've seen this happen around the world, Sweden being the premier example, is school choice is really cover for eliminating, destroying all actual school choice. And that sounds really counterintuitive. But of course, if you follow Congress very closely, you know they have a very bad habit of naming a law exactly the opposite of what it actually is or what it will do. Patriot Act, extremely unpatriotic, right? The Inflation Reduction Act poured jet fuel on inflation. So this is what they do, right? It's a normal thing for totalitarians to come up with clever marketing slogans that sound appealing, even if the actual policy that they're trying to defend does the exact opposite. So turning to Sweden as the first example, and I think Sweden is really important, not just on the school choice issue, but a lot of other issues. Because what I have found over there, I've got a lot of connections to Sweden, including the fact that my wife is from there, and don't hold that against her. But Sweden is like a testing ground. You have all sorts of crazy policy ideas that never would have been contemplated in a place like the United States that are first tried out in Sweden. This was the case with the transgender stuff. It was the case with homosexual marriage. It was the case with a lot of different economic policies that were later implemented across the Western world and in the United States. And the same is true in school choice. So they were one of the early pioneers in this. Back in the 1990s, they very widespread support for this idea that the government would start subsidizing private education. They called it school choice. In fact, they used a lot of the same terminology, a lot of the same arguments that we hear from school choice advocates in the United States today. Well, we're going to break up the education monopoly. We're going to introduce market forces. We're going to have competition. And all of those things sound appealing to rational, intelligent people who recognize the public school system as a disaster. So it's an easy sell. But what happened was, and it didn't even take a full 2 decades for this to come about. I was living there when it happened. They passed under a conservative government, by the way, what they call a center-right government that was supposedly very free market oriented. They passed what they called the Education Reform Act that obliterated all school choice. Essentially, any private school that was taking government money after this was required to teach the government curriculum, to remove Bibles, to remove prayer, to remove any kind of religious doctrine that may conflict with the state's really crazy curriculum. First graders need to learn about gender stuff. And in the same piece of legislation, they banned homeschooling. So in one fell swoop, in less than 20 years after the advent of universal school choice, all school choice was eliminated in Sweden. And of course, the school choice advocates in America who said, wow, look how great Sweden's doing, never apologized for this fiasco, even though they were trying to market it here. And Sweden is just the tip of the iceberg. Same thing happened in South Africa, where I used to live. Same thing has happened in multiple Canadian provinces. Same thing happened in Australia. The same thing is now starting to happen in various American states. So it's a cautionary tale, Robert, that I think people need to understand.
Yeah, the first thing people hear, they probably never even heard of school choice until post-COVID, when it was revealed, over Zoom, screens, all the things that teachers were teaching. The school system was, in some instances, forcing them to teach, and parents were horrified by it and thought, I need to get out of the system. We saw, a huge rise in homeschooling and in private schools and waiting lists and all sorts of things. And this was pre-government funding these things. And now, a couple years later, the government has gotten on board. And a lot of times people don't know where these ideas have come from, or that even other countries have tried them. And so, people accuse me of saying, oh, this is a slippery slope. That hasn't happened here yet. But it's happened in almost virtually every single country that has adopted this beforehand. And we need to be, I think, innocent as doves and wise as serpents, that this isn't something that, the conservative think tanks in our country have kind of adopted this, but that's not where it came out of at all. And you've done a lot of work on the United Nations, and part of the United Nations is UNESCO. So for those of us who you can't keep track of all the different acronyms the left throws at us, what is UNESCO? What's its goals? And, why are some of these ideas coming from it?
Sure.
Can you just break that down a little bit?
Yeah, this goes back to the international angle here. So UNESCO is the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. I would argue, even though a lot of people would disagree with me who don't follow the UN as closely as I do, I would argue it's one of the most important UN agencies because it focuses on so-called education. The UN has repeatedly said in international agreements going at least back to the 1980s, in some cases before, that education is the critical tool they're going to use to bring about all these changes that they want in the world, whether it be on the environment or the economy or global governance, peace, etc. And so UNESCO is really the premier agency that deals with that. Now, UNESCO handles a lot of other things as well. In addition to education, they do science, so-called. They also do cultural issues. They do the UNESCO World Heritage designations. But for our purposes, let's just focus on education. First of all, the guy who runs the education component at UNESCO is literally a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party. I wish I were kidding. I'm not. This is, of course, the regime that has murdered more people than any other government in all of human history. So right there, big red flag. Now, I've got the game plan, Robert. I have the report. The UNESCO put this out in 2021. I'm actually looking at it right now. It's called UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, Regulating Public-Private Partnerships, Governing Non-State Schools, and Equity Perspective. And the essence of this report is we got to figure out how to bring all these, what they call non-state education providers. That would be CC, that would be private schools, it would be Christian schools, various different alternatives. And of course, homeschoolers, right? Homeschooling parents. It's an effort to figure out how do we bring them all under the government's control. And their answer is actually very simple. Give them free, quote unquote, money and create these public-private partnerships. Once the government starts funding these private schools, then it says in very clear language, then we can impose whatever we want on them. We can impose equity goals. We can impose testing regimes. We can require them to enforce non-discrimination in hiring and admissions. So your Christian school might have to admit a Muslim teacher or a transgender guy wearing a dress to teach the kindergarten kids. And as you read this report, it just flies in the face of everything that Christians understand from the Bible about education. Here's a money quote. The state remains the duty bearer of education as a public good. No, right? We understand from reading the scriptures that parents are the duty bearers of education, not the state. And to the extent that we delegate any of our power and responsibility to any other entity, it's still our responsibility as parents. So as you read this outrageous report, I encourage people to read it. It's not that long. It's about 80 pages, if I remember correctly. They say right there, once the schools start taking public money, they cannot be exempt from complying with centrally defined curricula. learning standards, and student admissions criteria, among other public regulations. They say that giving these schools government money can enforce centralization and control of the school choice and admissions procedures. This is all in the report, right? People can read this. And of course, a lot of people think UNESCO is kind of this obscure thing that doesn't impact the United States. The Secretary of Education for 7 years under Barack Obama said it was the premier partner of the U.S. government in transforming education, not just here, but around the world. And on the school choice front, the man who describes himself as a school choice evangelist, Corey DeAngelis, was actually listed on their website for a long time as an advisor. Now, they scrubbed that after it started getting attention. But I hope people realize that these ideas about how to bring private schools under control have already been outlined, have already been explored by the United Nations, and they're not messing around. And of course, I don't mean to imply that your average state legislator in Oklahoma or Kansas or Utah has any sense of these things. The vast majority of them are very well intentioned. They don't realize what is happening here, but the fact remains this is a plan. They've put it on paper. There's no speculation. And you mentioned how this has already happened in other countries, Robert. This has already happened in the United States. The Government Accountability Office did an interesting report in 2016. And I want to quote for it because they say this. Voucher and ESA programs generally place some requirements on participating private schools, according to GAO's review of program documents, survey responses, and interviews with program officials. So everybody should be clear that with government money come regulations and control.
And I'll touch on that. I want to touch on some other things that you mentioned. As a conservative, I want government to have strings attached to the money it gives out because there needs to be accountability measures. So it's kind of, I always thought that people like, oh, they don't need to have any accountability. That's what Arizona had at first. And of course, almost immediately they start adding accountability measures. But it's, if they're doling out tax dollars, we should know how it's being spent. That's the conservative position. And the equity, right? Equity should be a word that sets off our radar. And quite frankly, the picture of Corey DeAngelis by the Equity Lab and that he was advising on that should have been the picture that ruined his career instead of the ones that ended up doing that or forcing him to go to a new nonprofit, probably financed by the same people who financed his old nonprofit. And Lisa Logan, she's going to be on this show, or we may have already released her episode. And her and I dive into the GEM report even more. So I definitely encourage everyone to check that out. All these episodes on school choice are going to be a little bit different. But I want to hang on this idea that you read there, that the state has a duty of public good for financing these things. And so, what I'm trying to say and what we believe is that the parents have that duty, that the best thing to do is getting kids out of the public school system. Doesn't mean getting them out of the system that's ran by the government, although that's part of it, but also financed by the government. But it seems like these small, these people would say that they're conservative, small government are buying into this idea that it is the state's responsibility to pay for education because it's a public good. And personally, we believe that it's a private good and the responsibility of the parents. So I was wondering, could you, what is that mindset versus the mindset that we have? Can you break that down a little bit more for our listeners?
Happy to do it, Robert. And I taught economics for 12 years. Okay, so this concept of a public good is something I understand very well. I taught it for 12 years to high school seniors, some of the brightest high school seniors in America. And there is a such thing as a public good that we talk about in economics, and it has a very clear definition. It's a good that is both non-rival and non-excludable. Non-rival meaning that if one person enjoys it, it's not going to interfere with another person's enjoyment of it. A cheeseburger is not non-rival. If I eat the cheeseburger, you can't eat the cheeseburger. Therefore, it is rival. One of us can have it, the other one cannot. Then this idea of non-excludable. Something that's non-excludable means that it is either impossible or extremely difficult to exclude somebody from benefiting from that. The ultimate example of a public good, of course, is a lighthouse, right? You could put a lighthouse up and you can't exclude certain ships from seeing the light. They're all going to benefit from that. And it's not rival, right? It's not like if two ships enjoy the lighthouse light, then that third ship is not going to be able to because that light has already been consumed. So a lighthouse is really the ultimate example of public good. And there are things that loosely fit into that category of public good. You might say the military, right? We can't have a system where the military protects my house and my neighbor's house, but not the guy down the street because he didn't pay the taxes. And so in that sense, the military protection is non-excludable and it's non-rival, right? My enjoyment of U.S. military protection from foreign adversaries doesn't interfere with my neighbor's enjoyment of that. So there are things that are public goods. And within the field of economics, we can debate these things. Is that a public good? What role should the government play in providing that public good, if any? And these debates have been going on for generations. But let's look for a moment now at education. Does education fit the definition of public good? The obvious answer is, of course it doesn't, right? Of course it's rival. If I've got 10 kids sitting in a classroom, I can't fit another 1,000 kids into that classroom because there's already a teacher in there, and you can't have 1,000 kids in a classroom and still expect to have a proper educational experience. Then the idea of non-rival. Is it possible simply to exclude somebody who hasn't paid for a good from consumption of that good? And of course it is, right? You lock the door if you have to. This is very simple. So there should be absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind. Education does not even come close to meeting the definition of public good as economists have always understood it. So what does the UN mean when they say it's a public good? Well, first of all, they prove that they're economic illiterates. They have no idea what they're saying. Second of all, they show a really dangerous agenda here because they actually say this throughout the report. They view parents as stakeholders, but also as obstacles to be overcome. So they have the relationship totally backwards. Parents are the ones who are in charge of the upbringing, the education, and the discipleship of their children. Now, parents have the ability to delegate some of that responsibility, some of that authority to other people. And of course we do, right? I've got my kids in CC. You have your kids in CC. So we delegate some of that responsibility to the organization, to the tutors, to other families that are involved. But we don't give up our responsibility and say, well, then CC or the public school is ultimately responsible for the education of our children. That's still the parents' responsibility. So it's a very, very, first of all, it's inaccurate. But second of all, even worse than being inaccurate, it's a very dangerous idea. This is the kind of idea that has reigned in places like Communist China, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Cambodia, Cuba. And I don't mean to sound alarmist. I don't mean to suggest that the people pushing school choice should be compared with Hitler or Stalin. But the idea that the education of our children, really the most important part of bringing up our children, is the responsibility of the state, is abhorrent, it's totalitarian, and frankly, it's incredibly dangerous to family, to children, to liberty, and even to civilization.
Yeah, you talked about the parents in the state, and MSNBC's one of their hosts had a clip that basically said, we've got to get rid of this idea that children belong to parents. I saw a clip of some professor at some Ivy League university. He basically said that the only reason that parents have rights is because the state lets them have rights. And so when people say these ideas are crazy, there's one of the mainstream media news sites and a major professor that are saying these things. And so it must be guarded. And I think, some of these ideas from the United Nations too is this idea of children's rights. And I know even some right-wings people have got onto this idea of that the children have these rights, or that they can supersede the parental rights. And the whole thing is continuing to just divide the family and destroy it. And, it might be a public good in China, where it's a communist country and you need, you need the pseudo slaves, I guess I'd call them, to be able to do certain things. But in a free society, it's definitely a private good because you benefit from it. You can make your life better or worse based on those things. And so I think this idea of a public good, a lot of people don't really understand that. And, it's something that you mentioned earlier with UNESCO, with their climate. And of course, I think of, you hear people get anxiety, and I think you've even heard of people like with assisted suicide over global warming because they just don't want to have kids, or they've been basically scared to death in K through 12. So I think for those of you who maybe needed another example of how the United Nations and UNESCO is already influencing public policy in the United States through the education. Um, yeah, imagine your local private school that's currently private suddenly gets addicted to this money, dependent on it, and then Greta Thunberg tells them that they have to start teaching her science book, or they're going to get defunded. And so I think that's exactly what we've seen, hypothetically, or that's not her book because I don't think she's written a book, but that type of thing has happened in all of these other countries. So I call these. I always say, like, one, I'm really grateful for anyone who runs for office because obviously it's very public facing, and you get scrutiny, and your family gets scrutiny, and there's not a lot of privacy. So I don't want anybody to take this personally, but I really feel like the right, in this sense, the GOP, the center right party in our country, just like the center right party in Sweden, who initially enacted school choice, they're useful idiots, right? The globalists don't really care whether this is a Democrat policy or a Republican policy because they know what the end game is. And quite frankly, most of these politicians who are pushing it in the United States, they just don't have a deep understanding of what the end goal is. They've heard it from some think tank that they told was good, or some donors are pushing it, or something like that. So, Alex, what would you want to tell politicians who might be listening in, or maybe a mom who's going to go have a meeting with a politician explaining why she doesn't support school choice? Like what are some of those things that should be specifically to those writing legislation?
Well, there's several things that you mentioned that I think are really important to roll into this. This whole idea that children belong to the government, this has now become the dominant view among a significant segment of our population, and that includes very much the mainstream of the Democrat Party, the mainstream of what used to be called the mainstream media, the CNNs, the MSNBCs of the world. It is very much a part of government policy now. If you look at some of the policies that Democrats have put in during Barack Obama's administration, for example, the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services came together and put out a policy document where they said that parents could be equal partners with the government in raising their own children. But all it took was a very quick skimming through the document to realize that they didn't even intend to allow you to be an equal partner. You were going to be the junior partner responsible for implementing the government's goals. And then you take it up to the international level, and that's exactly what we're seeing. You mentioned this whole idea of children's rights. And I want to stop on that for just a minute because this is important to share with our policymakers, with our lawmakers, and even with our activist leaders. If you look at what the UN means by this, it would send chills down your spine, at least if you see the world through the lens of America, our Constitution, or the Bible. For example, the UN has an international agreement they call the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is a treaty. Now, the U.S. government is one of only 2 national governments in the world that have not ratified this yet, and it's for good reason. And we get a lot of flack from that, from the UN and from the Europeans. They say, oh, it's only America and Somalia that won't sign up to that thing. If you read what it says, it's terrifying. It argues that all decisions have to be made in what it describes as the best interests of the child. And, at first glance, that sounds reasonable. All parents want decisions to be made in the best interest of their children. But what is more significant than the language is what it means. And what it means is the UN and government will determine what is in the best interest of the children, not parents. That's why this agreement is needed. And they make this very clear. Now, Scotland was the first government that really got very vigorous in implementing this. And they passed a law almost a decade ago now. And they actually cited the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in this law, they assigned what they called a named person to every single child born in Scotland. So you're born, the government assigns a named person, a government official, to oversee your development from the time you're born until the time you reach adulthood. They're basically looking over your parents' shoulders to determine whether you are being raised in accordance with what the UN views as important. Now, let's get back to this idea of human rights. The master document when it comes to the UN's regime on human rights is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Anybody can read this. I encourage people to read it and compare it with, say, the views of our founding fathers, what the Bible teaches. They are not just incompatible, they're completely opposite in their view of the origins of rights, the role of government in securing rights. But one of the things, Article 29, to give you a sense of what these says, is none of these rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. In other words, you have no rights if you want to use them against what the UN wants. But then you go to Article 26 that deals with education. It says education needs to be compulsory, in other words, education at gunpoint. And then it says all education shall, not may, shall further the activities of the United Nations. And so what that means in very plain English is if the education that you're providing for your children doesn't further the activities of the United Nations, or worse, runs counter to the activities of the United Nations. If you teach your children the sovereignty of nations was God's design for humanity, for example, well, you're not just a bad educator, you're violating your children's right to education. And so that brings us back to, what do we say to lawmakers? Well, I think there's several arguments that need to be made. First of all, the pragmatic argument, it's a bad policy. It's going to cost taxpayers a bunch of money. It is going to destroy genuine school choice. It's going to destroy independence of private education and homeschooling. It is also going to create a new class of dependence. Why would we want a new class of dependence on government? We should be working to remove people from dependency on government, not bring more people into dependency. So first of all, it's very bad policy just from a pragmatic perspective. Second of all, from a biblical perspective, from the perspective of rights, it's an incredibly dangerous idea because it starts from this false presupposition that the government is the one that is in charge of children. It's not. Again, read your Bible, read your Constitution, read your founding documents. This is clearly a responsibility of parents, and to the extent that parents need help, they should be reaching out to their extended family, to churches, to nonprofit organizations, to neighbors, to friends, to their church, etc. So this is just wrong on every level. And last but not least, we know what this is ultimately aimed at. Your legislator may not know this, and so that's where you can come in and educate them. But we know. We just went over the UNESCO General Education Monitoring Report. So we know what they're planning to do with this. It is a sinister plot. It's a trap. And so when you talk to your lawmakers, tell them to think of a mousetrap, right? What does a mousetrap do? It entices a mouse by offering free cheese. And as soon as the mouse eats the free cheese, the mouse is trapped. That is, I think, the best way to think about school choice broadly. Now, I always take the approach that, we don't want to come off as unnecessarily combative or annoying. And so I always start with what I consider to be a positive. It's great that we've now moved beyond the discussion of how do we reform these failing government indoctrination camps into this new and improved territory where we're talking about what's the best and fastest way to get the children out. So I love that we're having this discussion now. We should be having this discussion, but let's recognize that this is a bad idea pragmatically. It's a bad deal for the taxpayer. It threatens the independence of public or of private education, and it violates biblical principles.
Hey everyone, interrupting today's episode to tell you a little bit about the Education Independence Network. We all know that school choice is a trending topic and it's hard to know what to make of it. So we have created ChooseEducationIndependence.com so that you can choose better. In Challenge 2, our theme is Freedom Provides Opportunities for Noble Choices. So, how do we make good choices when so much information is flying around us? Well, we need good information. So join the Education Independence Network and learn about advocacy opportunities in your state. And go to ChooseEducationIndependence.com to find out more today. That's ChooseEducationIndependence.com. Now let's go back to the show. That's great. One of the things that I've been accused of, and you might have been too, is, oh, you're just in bed with the teachers union. You're helping the teachers unions. And even friends of ours who are sympathetic, they're like, but isn't that what the teachers unions are saying us? Like, help me clear that up. So how in this instance are you and I big friends with the teachers union?
Yeah, I always find that one of the most bizarre accusations because the teachers unions hate me with a passion. They hate you with a passion. They hate homeschoolers with a passion. In fact, almost every year the NEA gets together and they come up with these goofy resolutions about how parents aren't qualified to provide an education for their own children, which of course is ridiculous. So we could not disagree more with the teachers unions. And we have very different motivations here. The teachers unions are in this to preserve the monopoly of government indoctrination masquerading as education. Obviously, obviously nobody who is on the conservative side wants to preserve this taxpayer-funded monstrosity that is destroying our children. I mean, plenty of conservatives do think we ought to have decent public schools, but the teachers' unions are so far out in left field. Now, it's possible for people who believe entirely different things on almost everything to have a point of agreement on some things, right? Adolf Hitler built good highways. That doesn't mean that everybody who thinks we need to have good highways is a Nazi, right? Self-evidently. So the teachers' unions are a major threat to our children. They're a major threat to our political process. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year electing people who are hostile to the family, hostile to individual liberty, and ultimately hostile to good education. So the teachers' unions and the people who criticize school choice from a biblical or a constitutional or a conservative perspective could not be further apart. It just so happens that we oppose the same policy for wildly different reasons.
No, that's good. That's a good answer, because I always tell people, it's like, hey, sometimes, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. But yeah, they're, I mean, and to me too, it's like, okay, well, and I had this question, and I know you're not necessarily a policymaker, but say like you have a state like Arizona and then it goes blue. I mean, couldn't the kind of the strings being attached to these school choice dollars is saying, if you have students in your system, that your teachers have to be allowed to unionize or join the teachers union, or you have to, hey, Christian school, you have to follow all the union rules in order to continue to be eligible to take this money. I mean, couldn't this actually expand the teachers union power over time?
It absolutely could. And we've seen that in some cases with charter schools, right? You get these charter schools, and then suddenly a new political regime comes in, and they say, well, now all the charter school teachers can unionize. And so that, of course, undermines part of the purpose for having the charter school, at least what we were told. But this is a very real issue. And it doesn't apply just to the unionization of teachers. It applies across the board. And we saw this in Arizona most clearly, most recently, because Arizona was the first state to implement universal so-called school choice. And then they got a Democrat governor, and one of her first orders of business, I mean, right when she got sworn in, was put out this big press release about how, hey, we're giving out $1 billion a year in tax money now, and it is unacceptable that all these private schools are teaching who knows what, and parents are using the money on who knows what. So we want them to be up to the same educational standards. We want the teachers to have the same regulations. So this is inevitably going to happen. And don't think that because you live in a really red state that you're immune from that kind of stuff. It could be a federal court ruling. It could be a bureaucratic decision. It could be some policy coming out of Washington, D.C. Once your private school or your homeschool is dependent on government funding, it's a wide open door for regulations to come in of any kind. And it might not even necessarily be Democrat regulations. So we have to be very, very aware of this possibility that as soon as you become dependent on the state, you will be taking your instructions from the state sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and again, people say it's a slippery slope, but sometimes people are like, well, it hasn't happened yet. And sometimes like the law hasn't even been implemented in half of these states. It's just going to start now. And even Sweden, it took 19 years from the initial passing of, they basically, I think, said 80% of whatever the county equivalent was on public school, they had to spend on private school. And eventually they made it so that all the private schools had to teach exactly what the public schools were teaching. So really the only choice families were able to eventually have is which four walls your students living in. And I think that's or learning in. And that's really the ultimate end of the school choice, is everyone's going to get the same equitable education, right? You can't have people different curriculums doing different educational pedagogy, different class sizes. None of that is equitable. And so when you have a large group of people in our country that want that equity, of course we have to fight that. But if the government's paying for everything, then why shouldn't they dictate the terms of it? I think the Supreme Court, and this is the thing that, like, being classically educated, they say, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. But those of us who do study history are doomed to watch everyone else repeat it. So the Supreme Court during COVID, our company at Classical Conversations, we have over 100 employees. And so those who might not remember, Joe Biden said all hospitals have to have, COVID protocols, and everyone has to get the vaccine. And any company that has over 100 employees has to get the vaccine. And I know people that have government contractors, and then they started putting in the government contracts that you couldn't have a government contract unless you had a vaccine protocol that matched what they wanted. And so this went the whole way up to the Supreme Court. We were involved in fighting that along with Alliance Defending Freedom. And the Supreme Court ruled that the employer mandate, the 100 employers, could not be enforced, that it was an illegal mandate. But they ruled that the hospital one was absolutely legal because the government, through Medicaid and Medicare, was paying the hospital's bills. And so since the federal government was ultimately responsible for paying the bill, they could dictate how those services are given. And so within the last, this isn't some hypothetical thing you and I are discussing. This is something that happened within the last 4 years inside our country. The Supreme Court saying whoever pays the bills can write the terms of the agreement. And so this isn't hypothetical at all.
Yeah, Robert, I think that's a really important to make because, and I've noticed this too. You can go to a Catholic hospital, you can go to a Lutheran hospital, you can go to a Jewish hospital, you can go to a Presbyterian hospital, you can go to a nonprofit hospital. And what you'll find is everyone is virtually identical in terms of their policy. Yeah, one might have some Bible verses on the wall, but the treatment protocols are the same, the regulations are the same, and that is for a very simple reason. It's because of Medicare and Medicaid. Once the government started paying the bills, all of the distinctives of these hospitals were obliterated. And so that's what we saw during COVID, but that's what we see now. And there was a really interesting forecast that was put out just recently by an organization called the Learning Council. And they did predict that we're going to see a massive exodus from the government school system. They said that by 2030, 16 million more school-aged children would flee from the public school system, that 1 in 3 would be homeschooled. But they also, so that was the good news, but they also predicted that the line between home education, private education, and public schools would be so blurry that you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference hardly anymore. You'd have people who were doing some homeschooling at home with government programs. You'd have private schools that were basically being funded by and controlled by the government. And they actually used the hospital metaphor. They say that this shift out of government schools into what they call a far more privatized but regulated industry would be much like what has already happened with most of the energy industry and hospitals, right? The reason being, once the government's paying for everything, it's going to harmonize it. It's all going to be exactly the same. We'll all be taking the same tests. Yeah, you might be able to have a Bible verse on the wall of your classroom, but functionally speaking and practically speaking, it will be almost identical to what the government is doing, which is what we need to avoid at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So help us understand and myself understand, because when they say public schools, they mean managed by the government or by the teachers union or by these administrators. And then they say private schools, they're talking about a school managed by someone else. But now they're saying with a school choice, you could have a student financed by the public, which to me is a public school student in a building that's being managed by people outside of the government infrastructure, I guess. So why is that? Is that bad logic by their part or by our part? Should we accept that as saying that if the government pays for your educational bill, but you're, not in a quote unquote public school, that suddenly now you're a privately educated student?
That's the direction that they're going with this. And what was really troubling to me, we even heard this back in, I believe, 2018. You had Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education at the time, under a Republican administration, under a Trump administration, come out and openly, publicly say during a public speech, I have the video, say that we need to rethink our definition of public education. We need to realize that all education is ultimately important to the public, and therefore all education is public education. So with that thinking in mind, if all education is public education, you can't just have some homeschooler teaching their child things that the government may not agree with, that Noah's Ark was a real thing, or that the Bible is important, that the Bible is the Word of God. So it leads us down a very slippery slope. Anytime something becomes the purview of the public, which is another way of saying the government, you run the very real risk of eliminating choice, eliminating freedom. And that is what will inevitably happen here unless we slam on the brakes and say that this is unacceptable and we can't move in that direction. So watch out for that language, folks. It's coming. The shift is already happening in the way that this language is being used. And it's very strategic and it's very calculated. I don't know what was going through Betsy DeVos' head, but if you read some of the things that she put her name to, right? If you read, for example, the G20 Education Ministers Declaration, she was very open. All the G20 education ministers were very open about the fact that we're going to continue to internationalize education, that we're going to embed social emotional learning into everything, that we're going to have sustainability at the core of education. And when she talks about public education, she has told us that she means every segment of education, not just what's going on in a traditional government school. So, folks, we need to recognize this is an urgent threat to all of us, even the people in the public schools, because once there's no escape route, I can guarantee you it's going to get worse, and it's going to get worse real quick.
Yeah, and eventually, as we've seen in these other countries, through testing requirements and through different strings that they'll attach, eventually it doesn't matter who's in the front of your classroom teaching. It could be a great, wonderful Christian woman, but if she's told and she's being fired unless she teaches that, homosexuality is okay, or, boys and girls can interchange their sexuality, that the school is going to lose their funding. And if they're dependent on it, then they're going to absolutely, they'll bend the knee. Almost throughout history, everyone eventually bends the knee, or I say, typically anyone who's addicted to government money, if they don't continue to bend the knee, they eventually just get killed. They get martyred, because so few times has it happened that you can actually point to people that have done that, and it's not a bright ending for them, because that's the ultimate power. That's ultimate, middle finger to power, when you say you can't buy me off anymore, and I'm going to do what's right. And so, I think that's what we're doing, and why that makes people so mad at us, especially on the right, because they think, why aren't you guys on board? And I always tell them, please convince me. Classical conversations could increase prices. That's I did the math. We could make $700 million more per year, and that's significantly 20 times. I don't even know what the number is. Probably 20 times more than we bring in revenue now. And of course, almost all of that would be profit, because we can run on the same group that we have now. And that's just taking the government cheese. So it's I like to tell people, try to convince me otherwise, because I'm very financially motivated to be told I can change my moral position. As a Christian, I have to always go back to the Bible, and I don't see anywhere where there's not a single verse that I've been able to find that says the government has any responsibility for children, and especially for children's education. Why are some Christians buying into this idea?
It may sound cliche, Robert, but I think the short answer is 5 generations of government education masquerading as education. We have forgotten so much. America, even recently, 90+% of Americans describe themselves as Christians. But what we have seen since the advent of government schools, and this really began in earnest in World War I, when the majority of American children started getting the bulk of their education by government, we've seen a cataclysmic decline in a biblical worldview. Because the Bible is very clear about the role of government. The government has a job. The government's important. When people say I'm anti-government, I say you're totally wrong. I'm 100% pro-government if the government is doing its job. And its job is articulated in multiple places, most clearly perhaps in Romans 13. Punish evil, be a terror unto evil, protect the good. And there's not a lot of room there for argument. God told us what is evil. Theft is evil. Murder is evil. Slavery is evil. So we have a roadmap of government's job. It is to punish people who kill, who steal, who enslave, who rape, etc. Government's role is not to educate children, babysit children, pay for your health care, pay for your college, take your neighbor's money and give it to you. In fact, that would be sinful. It's covetousness and theft all rolled up into one. And God also very clearly defines the responsibilities of parents. Ephesians 6:4, my children's favorite Bible verse, is also very clear about this. Parents are to bring up their children, don't provoke them to anger. That's why my kids love that so much. But then it says that we're to bring them up in the discipline and the nurture and the admonition and the fear of the Lord, depending on which translation you're using. So that's the parent's job description. We are the ones who are to teach our children, to disciple our children, to care for our children, for their physical, their spiritual, their material needs. But that is never assigned to government. And frankly, it's not even assigned to the church. I love Christian schools. I'm very much in favor of the church getting more active in this realm. And historically, throughout Christian history, we have had a role for the church. But ultimately, the buck stops with parents. And that is the biblical position. And I challenge people to just read their Bible. And like you said, Robert, you could read your Bible all day, every day, upside down and sideways. You'll never find even a hint, an implication that the government has any responsibility or authority to deal with the education of children.
Well, yes. So please, if you're listening to our podcast today and can find a Bible verse, put it in the comments or send it to us on X. Alex and both that are active
I'll
on X.
retweet it, I promise. They found it.
Yeah,
No, there's no such thing. And that is very, very clear. And Christians have understood this for 2,000 years. It's only once government schools started indoctrinating multiple generations of Americans and teaching them false religion, false worldview, that we completely forgot what the purpose of government was, and we completely forgot the responsibility of parents.
Well, Alex, we got a couple minutes left. So, is there anything on school choice that you want our audience to know that we haven't covered today, that you feel like is on your heart, or something that they really need to be considerate of that they might not be hearing elsewhere?
Well, I would encourage people to get involved in this battle. I do believe it is one of the most important battles, if not the most important battle, in the fight to save our families, our faith, our liberties, our country, our Constitution, and our civilization. This is the one battle that if we get it wrong, we're going to lose everything, right? You can't undo the indoctrination of an entire society, at least not in any reasonable amount of time. So I know everybody's got priorities. We all want to fight the different political battles and the cultural battles. Some people it's pro-life, and I'm all about that. Where some people it's pro-gun, and those things are important. But ultimately, the education issue is the key issue. So be active in this, and I would encourage people to really start pushing school choice, but the real kind of school choice, right? Go to your church. Does your church actively promote Christian education? Does it actively serve the congregation in that respect? Even if it's just like, helping a single mom who doesn't have the money to be able to pull her child out of the public school to get them a good Christian education, whether homeschooling or CC or a Christian school locally. This is something that we all should be involved in. So I hope the people out there listening won't just take these arguments and say, wow, that was really intellectual. I feel more educated now. No, take these arguments, take this information, and go do something with it. And this is one of those battles, too. As Ronald Reagan said, closest thing to eternal life is a government program. It's not like we're going to be able to try out this big experiment with school choice, and then once they start taking over all our private schools, say, whoops, that was a mistake. Let's put it in reverse and go back to 2023. That's not going to work, folks. That's not going to work. So we've got to be active on this front. I know the money is tempting. I live here in Florida. I could get $50,000 a year if I would just surrender my principles, surrender my moral values, and take the government money. The price would be my freedom and my conscience. So we've got to be involved in this fight. It's coming to your state soon if it's not already there. And folks, I can't encourage you highly enough to take this really, really seriously, like it all depends on it, because it does.
Yeah, I think this is our fight for liberty. This could be our last stand. I don't know if we lose this battle, like you said, how do you get back? So we've got to take this fight seriously. Contact your legislators, let them know where you stand, educate yourself, make those relationships. And we've got to get to action now, because legislation is in session in almost every single state this time of year, or is about to be. And they've got some really dangerous laws on the books that they're trying to pass that will eventually lead to no choice at all. So Alex, thank you so much for being on the show today. Where can people connect with you, watch your show, etc.?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Robert. Always a pleasure. Of course, people can find me at CC, Senior Fellow here. Really honored to be able to do that. My personal website is libertysentinel.org. People can access our shows, a free newsletter. And then I serve as a volunteer executive director of Public School Exit. So if your church or your local group wants some help rescuing children from government schools and pursuing real school choice. You can find that all at publicschoolexit.com. And thanks again, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in to this special episode during School Choice Week, where we are pulling back the curtain, what's actually going on behind the scenes. And I just appreciate Alex being on today. So be sure to share this episode with a friend, maybe share it with a politician that you know, or some grassroots leader, so that they too can educate themselves on what's really going on behind the scenes in the school choice movement. Until next time, God bless and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.